Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, October 26th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the House approves a resolution backing Israel. So the House finally elected a speaker on Wednesday, and they elected a guy named Mike Johnson. He's a Republican from Louisiana, and his first order of business was putting a resolution on the floor to express strong support for Israel, and this was the first bill that he put forward in his role as speaker. So this resolution passed in a vote of 412 to 10, and it says that the U.S. stands with Israel in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack, and as Israel is relentlessly bombing Gaza. The resolution reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to providing military aid to Israel and said Congress will work to pass more. So the bill says that the House, quote, stands ready to assist Israel with emergency resupply and other security, diplomatic, and intelligence support, end quote. It also called for the U.S. to continue enforcing sanctions on Iran and condemned the Hamas attack. So 9 Democrats voted against the resolution, including Jamal Bowman, Andre Carson, Cori Bush, Al Green, Summer Lee, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Delia Ramirez, and Rashida Tlaib. And 1 Republican did vote against it, and that was Representative Thomas Massie. So explaining his opposition to the bill, Massie pointed to the sanctions aspect. He's opposed to sanctions as a policy, and also the promises of military support and aid. Massie said, quote, "It contains an open-ended promise of military support that is so broad that it could be interpreted to commit U.S. soldiers to the conflict. U.S. troops should not be engaged in this conflict," end quote. So Johnson won the speakership hours before the vote and pledged that his first action would be in support of Israel. He said, and now he said this right after winning the gavel to be Speaker of the House, Johnson said, quote, "Our nation's greatest ally in the Middle East is under attack. The first bill that I'm going to bring to this floor in just a little while will be in support of our dear friend Israel," end quote. So that's his priority, is Israel. So President Biden has requested $14 billion in new military aid for Israel as part of a massive $105 billion spending package that also includes $61 billion for the Ukraine war. There's also $7.4 billion that will go toward military aid to Taiwan and other spending in the region. It's not clear exactly how that's broken down. And also funds for border security. Now, it's not clear if the House will take up this entire spending package or if they're going to try to divide it into individual bills. I'm not really sure what's going to happen moving forward with that. So Johnson, he has previously voted against most of the Ukraine aid packages, pretty much all of them since the war started. This current conflict, I don't know what his record is going back years. And because of that, he has earned a grade of F from Republicans for Ukraine, which is a neoconservative group that's trying to rally GOP support for Ukraine. So, it's not clear what he's going to do with this big $105 billion spending bill. But I think after how long it took for them to elect a speaker, I don't think anybody's really going to try to oust him if he does bring it to the floor for a vote. But we'll see what happens as this thing goes forward. I know in the Senate, some Republicans are saying they're against lumping all this stuff together, but I don't think it's enough to really make a difference. I know Mitch McConnell's on board and the Republican leadership. So, all right, so the next one here, the Wall Street Journal reports that Israel agrees to delay Gaza ground invasion. So Israel has agreed to a request from the U.S. to delay its ground invasion of Gaza so the U.S. can send more missile defense systems to the region to prepare for an expected escalation of attacks on U.S. troops. And again, this was reported by the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, and there were similar reports earlier in the week. This one was a little more specific. It says that the U.S. is rushing to deploy nearly a dozen air defense systems to the region that will aim to protect U.S. troops stationed in Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said on Saturday that he ordered the deployment of a terminal high-altitude area defense battery, that's a THAAD missile system, and also multiple Patriot air defense systems to the region. This Wall Street Journal report said that Israel has agreed to hold off its invasion until the additional air defenses are put in place, which could be completed at the end of the week. So later on Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that a ground invasion was coming, but he did not say when. Netanyahu said, quote, "We are preparing for a ground invasion. I will not elaborate on when, how, or how many. I will also not elaborate on the various calculations we are making, which the public is mostly unaware of, and that is how things should be," end quote. So very vague, but still saying that they're going to go in. So the Pentagon, just a recap of the recent attacks, the Pentagon said on Tuesday that U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria have come under attack 13 times. There's been dozens of injuries. On Wednesday, there were some more attacks on these bases. And you see how many air defense systems the U.S. is sending. You know, they're expecting a huge escalation, it seems like, in attacks on U.S. troops. And this is all for supporting this brutal Israeli campaign in Gaza. So if U.S. troops start dying, they're going to be dying because of that, because of the U.S. support for what's happening in Gaza. So, you know, unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about this whole situation. I can't imagine really a de-escalation anytime soon, but we'll see how things play out. And this next story here is a report from Middle East Eye. And it says that Israel might flood Hamas tunnels with nerve gas. So I wasn't sure if I was going to run this up top, but I figured it was worth doing just in case, you know, this is right. So this report says that Palestinian resistance groups expect Israel to flood Hamas tunnels with nerve gas and chemical weapons under the surveillance of U.S. Delta Force commandos. So that's the big thing here, is that they're saying they're going to flood these tunnels with gas under the supervision of U.S. Special Operations Forces. And this is as part of a plan for a surprise attack on the Gaza Strip. And they quote a senior Arab source familiar with these Palestinian groups. So they're saying that this information is based on a leak originating from the U.S. That's what Middle East Eye sources are telling them. So it seems like a strange source that they're getting this from. But it says that Israel and the U.S. hope to achieve the element of surprise in order to penetrate Hamas tunnels, rescue an estimated 220 hostages, and kill thousands of soldiers belonging to Hamas's Al-Qasam's brigades. And they also said that this whole thing that we're seeing, that what I just went over, these reports of the U.S. saying that Israel agreeing to delay the ground invasion, they're saying that's part of some information warfare here, and that it is going to be a surprise attack, which means it could come sooner. And they're talking about Delta Force here, which when President Biden was over in Israel, the White House put up a picture on Instagram or something of him shaking hands with some Delta Force guys that were there, showing their face, which they're not supposed to show their identity, so they deleted it. But it does show that there's Delta Force commandos there. And this report mentions that. And we do know that the U.S. is very, very involved in Israel's planning of this Gaza invasion. Biden actually attended a meeting of the Israeli security cabinet while he was in Israel. That's a very strange thing. The U.S. sent a 3-star Marine Corps general to advise the Israelis, along with other officers, and they have offered special operations support for getting hostages out. So any plan that they have like this probably is, created with the help from the U.S. So we'll see what happens here. And again, this says that the leaked information that's saying Israel is delaying its ground invasion is misinformation aimed at gaining the element of surprise. So again, we'll just have to wait and see what happens here. All right, so the next one here, Israeli airstrikes kill 8 Syrian soldiers in southern Syria. So Israeli airstrikes targeted southern Syria early Wednesday morning, killing 8 soldiers and wounding 7 more. The strikes targeted the southern Deraa province and came after Israel said rockets were fired from Syria toward Israel. So this is Syria's news agency, and they quoted a source that said 8 were killed, 7 more were wounded, and there was some material damage. And the Israeli military said that its fighter jets struck military infrastructure and mortars belonging to the Syrian army in response to the launch toward Israel on Tuesday. So it's unclear if the Syrian military was responsible for firing the rockets into Israel. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK, said that the attack on Tuesday was launched by forces loyal to Hezbollah, which is likely referring to the Shia militias that operate in Syria. So it's not clear exactly who was behind that attack. And then later on Wednesday, Israel launched more airstrikes in Syria in the north that hit the Aleppo airport. So they put the Aleppo airport out of service again. And by my count, with these 2 separate airstrikes on Wednesday, this is the 30th time that Israel has bombed Syria this year. So even though some of these strikes are related to the current flare-up in Gaza and in southern Israel, this is kind of a normal thing for Israel to bomb Syria, but they have been doing it more since the October 7th Hamas attack and everything else that's been going on. And Syria never responds to the Israeli airstrikes. So, that's another thing is if Syria actually does start responding, that would be another potential big escalation. If they see Hezbollah might enter the fight and all the Shia militias and stuff, Syria might get in on it too. All right, where were we here? So the next one, Biden says that Palestinians are lying about civilian casualties. So President Biden on Wednesday accused Palestinians in Gaza of lying about the civilian casualty rate when he was confronted with the massive number of child casualties in Israel's bombardment. So according to the latest numbers from Gaza's health ministry, over 6,500 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's onslaught, including more than 2,700 children. So really horrific numbers. And a reporter asked Biden if the figures demonstrate that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is ignoring U.S. calls to minimize civilian casualties. Biden responded, quote, "What they say to me is I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed and it's the price of waging a war," end quote. So he added that Israel should be incredibly careful to go after Hamas and said that he has, quote, "no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using," end quote. So it's one way to, deflect questions about your support for what's going on in Gaza and for all these child casualties is to question the number and say, I don't believe them. They're probably lying. And the U.S. and Israel have begun to start doing this to cast doubt on the casualty rate coming from Gaza's health ministry because Gaza is ruled by Hamas. But there's a report from the Washington Post that said many experts, media outlets and, NGOs and people like that consider the numbers that usually come from Gaza's health ministry to be reliable. And they quoted Omar Shakir, who is the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch. And he said, quote, "Everyone uses the figures from the Gaza health ministry because those are generally proven to be reliable. In the times in which we have done our own verification of numbers for particular strikes, I'm not aware of any time which there has been some major discrepancy," end quote. So he made similar comments to Al Jazeera and said that the current numbers are believable based on the massive number of airstrikes Israel is unleashing on Gaza, which is one of the most densely populated places on earth. He said, quote, "We've been looking at satellite imagery. We've been looking at what's taking place. The numbers coming out of the ministry are not beyond reason. They're within the range of what one would expect from airstrikes of this intensity," end quote. So while on one hand you have the U.S. officials casting doubt on the numbers coming out of Gaza, they have also shrugged off the civilian casualties, framing them as a cost of war. So National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, as I covered, said on Tuesday, quote, "This is war, it is combat, it is bloody, ugly, and it's going to be messy. and innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward, end quote. And there's no indication that, you have Biden and these other U.S. officials saying that they're telling the Israelis to minimize civilian casualties. But we just keep seeing Israel's airstrikes increasing and increasing. All right, the next one here. State Department officials prepare Dissent cable over Gaza. So this is another one from Middle East Eye. And it says that the U.S. State Department staff are preparing urgent Dissent cables over Washington's support for Israel's relentless bombing campaign of Gaza. Several sources told Middle East Eye that tensions are at a fever pitch within the department, as officials are growing increasingly frustrated with the Biden administration's open backing of what human rights activists are calling war crimes against Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip. Middle East Eye understands that several diplomats are torn between staying in their jobs to try and influence policy or leave in protest. We know that one guy did leave in protest. And they're not happy with Biden's unconditional support for Israel's bombardment and the looming ground invasion. More than 6,000 Palestinians have been killed, including 2,000 children. They go through the numbers here. And on the Israeli side, it's still around 1,400 Israelis that have been killed since Hamas launched that attack on October 7th. So in one draft Dissent cable that was seen by Middle East Eye, diplomats wrote that Hamas's attack on Israel cannot be used as a justification for Israel to carry out the indiscriminate killing of innocent people in Gaza. The draft calls for the immediate cessation of hostilities in Israel, Gaza, and the occupied West Bank. So it's interesting that, they're not just opposing the full-throated support. They're saying we should be calling for a ceasefire. And apparently, these sources speaking to Middle East Eye say that this is the last resort before resigning, is trying this Dissent cable. So there is, it seems like, a big mutiny within the State Department, as was reported recently. So hopefully this has some effect on what's going on here, instead of just this continued full-throated support that's going to turn into a big regional war. All right, so the next one here. Oxfam says that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war against civilians. So this is Oxfam, the international charity group. They said Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war against Palestinian civilians living in Gaza, as barely any food is being delivered to the besieged enclave. So Gaza has been under blockade since 2006, and Israel imposed a total siege on October 9th, cutting off all food, fuel, and medicine. A limited number of aid trucks have been allowed into Gaza from Egypt recently, but Oxfam said only 2% of the food that used to be delivered into Gaza is going in right now. So Oxfam said in a press release, quote, "The international agency analyzed UN data and found that just 2% of food that would have been delivered has entered Gaza since the total siege. While a small amount of food aid has been allowed in, no commercial food imports have been delivered," end quote. So Oxfam said that prior to the total siege, 104 trucks a day delivered food to Gaza. So 104 trucks a day. And since the weekend, 62 trucks have been allowed into Gaza from Egypt, but only 30 were carrying food. They quote Abul Khalil, who's Oxfam's Middle East director. They said, quote, "The situation is nothing short of horrific. Where is humanity? Millions of civilians are being collectively punished in full view of the world. There can be no justification for using starvation as a weapon of war," end quote. So Oxfam said Gaza is also virtually out of clean water, making some of the food that has been let in, such as rice and lentils, useless because they don't have clean water or fuel to prepare the food. So the group said that Israeli airstrikes have also hit bakeries and supermarkets, further straining the food supply. And of course, the electricity blackout and lack of fuel is also disrupting the supply of food. They can't deliver things because they don't have fuel for trucks and things like that. All right, so the next one here. The New York Times goes against the Israeli narrative on the Gaza hospital blast. So this is interesting, and this is actually an investigation from the New York Times about whoops, sorry. I'm a little mixed up here. Okay, so here it is. So this is an investigation from the New York Times, and it is titled "A Close Look at Some Key Evidence in the Gaza Hospital Blast." And what's interesting about this is that this is the bombing of the Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City that happened on October 17th. The bombing actually hit the parking lot outside of the hospital where there was thousands of people sheltering in courtyards and things, because this is in Gaza City where people were told to evacuate. So a lot of people went to the hospital to take shelter. So anyway, you know how it went when this story first broke. It was Israel bombs hospital, 500 dead. And it was believable considering what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Israel came out and denied it. They said it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that actually hit the hospital parking lot. And they put out this video from an Al Jazeera live feed that shows what looks like a rocket is flying through the air, and then it breaks up midair, and then there's a blast on the ground, and then there's another big one at the hospital. So according to this New York Times investigation, and the U.S. has also pointed to this video as evidence, according to this investigation, that rocket was actually more likely fired from Israel, not from Gaza. And they also said that rocket was probably not the cause of the hospital blast because it was about 2 miles away. They looked at all the angles. The video that Israel put out was just one angle, and they looked at different feeds and they lined it up. So they're not saying that Israel did the bombing, but what they're saying is that Israel and the U.S.'s key piece of evidence is not evidence. It just has nothing to do with the blast on the ground. So it's pretty interesting to see that come from the New York Times. And they're still saying that, again, that they're not saying that this proves who was responsible, but they're saying, right now, they don't know. They're saying it's impossible to know who bombed that hospital. So again, it's interesting. And this is what the U.S. has been basing their whole thing on. Biden saying that he believed the Israeli story. And now the New York Times says that it's not true. It's not a piece of evidence at all. And we also know that there's other inconsistencies in the Israeli story. There were some experts that said that recording that they put out of what they said was 2 Hamas guys talking about how it was a rocket was fabricated. They also had contradicting things about where they said the rocket was launched from. So, there's a lot of holes in the Israeli story. And the death toll, too. So the Gaza Health Ministry says that 471 people were killed in the blast. The U.S. and Israel are also questioning the death toll. The U.S. intelligence believes the real number is somewhere between 100 and 300. So still either way, hundreds of people were killed. All right, so the next one here, Al Jazeera reporter's family killed in an Israeli air raid. So this story is from Al Jazeera, and this is their bureau chief in Gaza, and his family was killed. So the wife, son, daughter, and grandson of Wael Dadu, who's Al Jazeera Arabic's bureau chief in Gaza, they've been killed in an Israeli air raid. Footage aired on Al Jazeera showing him entering the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir el-Balah on Wednesday to see his dead wife, son, and daughter in the morgue. I was watching some of the video, really horrific stuff. He was shown crouching and touching the face of his 15-year-old son, Mahmoud, who wanted to be a journalist like his father. Later footage showed him holding the shrouded body of his 7-year-old daughter. So again, really, really horrific. And he spoke to Al Jazeera on his way out of the hospital, and he said, quote, "What happened is clear. This is a series of targeted attacks on children, women, and civilians. I was just reporting from Yarmouk about such an attack, and the Israeli raids have targeted many areas. We had our doubts that the Israeli occupation would not let these people go without punishing them, and sadly, that is what happened. This is the safe area that the occupation army spoke of," end quote. So he's saying that because they were in the south, where they were told to evacuate, but the airstrikes are still hitting the south. So this next story here is from Axios, and it says that Blinken asked Qatar to tone down Al Jazeera's coverage of the Gaza war. So Al Jazeera is funded by Qatar, and apparently this article is from Axios. Blinken told a group of American Jewish community leaders on Monday that he asked the Qatari prime minister less than 2 weeks ago to tone down Al Jazeera's rhetoric about the war in Gaza. So Blinken's comments suggest that the administration, which has asserted its support for the independent press globally, is concerned Al Jazeera's framing of the conflict could escalate tensions in the region. So it's kind of interesting, and pairing this with that other story, what do they want them to tone down exactly? And this says that he's talking more about the Arabic coverage, so I'm not sure exactly what that's like compared to the English language stuff that I read. But, it just goes to show the things, their priorities here. They're not telling Israel to tone down their bombings. They're telling media outlets to tone down their reporting, to not make Israel look so bad. And then you see Israel kills the whole family of an Al Jazeera reporter in Gaza. All right, so the last one here is the only story not about the Gaza war, and it says that Russia is going to withdraw from the nuclear test ban treaty. So Russia is set to revoke its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That's the CTBT. And this treaty prohibits all nuclear weapons tests and explosions, and the U.S. has never ratified it. So this is putting Russia in the same line as the U.S. when it comes to this treaty. So Russia's upper house of parliament, the Federation Council, approved the bill on Wednesday to revoke the ratification. The lower house, which is the State Duma, they approved the bill last week, and now it heads to Putin's desk for his signature. So Russia ratified this treaty in 2000, and Putin has said that revoking it would mirror U.S. policy. So the U.S. and Russia are still participants in the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and that prohibits all nuclear weapons tests except those performed underground. So also on Wednesday, Russia conducted a simulation of a nuclear strike, but this wasn't any kind of live fire thing. It was just a simulation. And it's unclear at this point if Russia plans to resume live fire nuclear tests. So actually last week, the U.S. conducted an explosion at a nuclear test site in Nevada. And according to Bloomberg, the test used chemicals and radioisotopes to validate new predictive explosion models that can help the Energy Department detect atomic blasts in other countries. So if they use radioisotopes, it sounds like it was a nuclear explosion. And Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said that Moscow perceived the test as a political message. It came just a few hours after Russia said it was going to revoke its ratification of this treaty. So Ryabkov said, quote, "It is definitely a political message. We remain vigilant. As our president said, if the United States makes a move toward full-scale nuclear tests, we will have to give a reciprocal response in that field too," end quote. Just another sign about how there's no arms control. It's all breaking down. And, I haven't been paying super close attention to the Ukraine war lately because of all this Gaza stuff, but there's no sign that the U.S. and Russia are, working towards any kind of arms control talks. So that's always something to be concerned about, is like a real nuclear arms race seems to be, happening now, and it's just not good. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder, Did Putin Kill Yevgeny Prigozhin? One from Jim Fitzgerald, The Making of Hamas. One from Thomas Knapp, When It's Always the Beginning of History, It Can Never Be the End of War. One from Hanan Majadil, No to Collective Punishment Against Gaza. And one from Aaron Mate, Joe Biden's Armageddon, From Gaza to Ukraine. And that is everything. You can always help us out by sharing the show, liking, subscribing on YouTube or wherever you prefer to watch. If you listen to the audio version, leave a rating or a review, especially if you listen on an Apple. That would be nice to get some more reviews over there. But that's everything for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Got one more show this week. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.